If you are an American today, you may not feel like your country is collapsing, but you almost certainly feel something thinger and more unsettling. Life feels tighter, less forgiving, less predictable. Price keep rising faster 10 ways. Housing feels permanently out of reach. Healthcare remains expensive, confusing, and fragile. And beneath all of it, there is a growing sense that the system is no longer built to protect ordinary people, but to manage all of it. This is the backdrop against which the United States withdrew from the World Health Organization. On the surface, it looks like a foreign policy decision. In reality, it is something far more intimate. It is a signal about how power is exercised, how risk is redistributed, and who ultimately absurdly absorbs the consequences when leaders make a no-tell choice. Supporters frame the move as strength, sovereignty, independence. They argue that America should not be bound by international institutions, that it should act freely, decisively, and on its own terms. But behind this language lies a deeper and more dangerous pattern, the expansion of executive power at the expense of systemic resilience, then quick transfer of risk from the T to the individual. Abuse of power in modern democracies rarely looks dramatic. It does not arrive with thanks in the streets or constitutions torn apart overnight. It arises quietly through speed. Executive order. Tough decisions made faster than institutions can respond and citizens can understand. Over time, this speed becomes a habit, and habit becomes a governing philosophy. The ritual from who fits this pattern perfectly. It bypasses long-term coordination in favor of immediate political messaging. It treats public global risk as a matter of national pride. And it assumes that the United States can isolate itself from a world where health risks are inherently transnational. Viruses do not respect borders. They do not recognize sovereignty. A move through airports, trade routes, migrant flows, and global supply chains. Modern medicine itself is global. Pharmaceuticals rely on international inputs. Protective equipment is manufactured across continents. Data about outbreaks emerges first where outbreaks begin, not where political power is concentrated. Leaving global health coordination does not eliminate dependence. It simply makes that dependence less visible and more dangerous. It raises us early warning capacity. It weakens information sharing channels. And it increases the likelihood that when the next health crisis emerges, the United States will react later, not sooner. Time is the most valuable asset in a pandemic. Days matter. Weeks are decisive. A small delay in detection or coordination can translate into exponential spread. Hospitals do not collapse gradually. They reach a tipping point and fail suddenly. When it happens, outcomes deteriorate rapidly and the damage becomes irreversible. Americans have lived through this before. They remember overwhelm the emergency rooms. They remember shortage of basic medical supplies. They remember fear, confusion, and political division spreading as fast as the virus itself. That memory has not disappeared. It sits just beneath her face, ready to reserve face with the next shock. Public trust already fragile. Erase further under policies like this. Most people do not read policy documents or legal justifications. They interpret signals. And the signal sent by withdrawal is clear to many citizens. Global cooperation is optional, and health security can be subordinated to political posture. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. When trust weakens, compliance weakens. People question guidance. They reject recommendation. They retreat into fragmented formations. In a health crisis, that fragmentation is not just inefficient. It is lethal. The consequences extend far beyond public health. Pandemics are economic weapons, whether intentional or not. They disrupt supply chains, halt production, destabilize labor markets, and strain public finances. Inflation follows shortages. Debt follows emergency spending. And recovery becomes uneven and unequal. The people who suffer most are not policymakers or elites. They are renters facing rising housing costs. Workers whose wage rates fell to keep pace with inflation. Families struggling with food prices. Individuals with inadequate insurance forced to choose between treatment and financial ruin. If we can global coordination makes a future crisis even slightly worse, that marginal increase will translate into almost irrelevant damage. hundreds of billions in lost output, millions pushed closer to precarity, and the deeper sense that the system is stacked against ordinary people. This is why critics describe the policy not merely as misguided, but as an abuse of power. Not because it breaks the law, but because it breaks balance. It centralizes authority while decentralizing consequences. It allows leaders to act decisively while insulating themselves from the fallout. Executive power expands most easily during periods of fear and uncertainty. Health crises provide ideal conditions for this expansion. Decisions are framed as urgent. Debate is portrayed as witness. Opposition is dismissed as obstruction. Over time, this dynamic reshapes governance itself. Isolation abroad often pays with tighter narrative control at home. As external cooperation diminishes, internal messaging becomes more centralized. Complexity is flattened, EU slogans, nation is reframed, and public discourse narrows. For ordinary Americans, this creates a feeling of quiet powerlessness. Not overt oppression, but systemic detachment. Decisions feel distant. Motivations feel political rather than practical. And the gap between leadership and life experience widens. The most dangerous aspect of this trajectory is not any single decision, but the pattern it reveals. A pattern of unilateralism. A pattern of institutional withdrawal. A pattern where strength is defined as acting alone. Even the deeper problem is not the World Health Organization itself. The deeper problem is what this decision reveals about how power is now exercised in the United States. Withdrawal from global institutions is not an isolated act. It is part of a broader shift toward governing through executive authority, speed, and confrontation rather than consensus, resilient institutional balance. Over time, the presidency has accumulated extraordinary power. Congress moves slowly. Course reacts after the facts. The executive branch, by contrast, can act immediately. In moments of uncertainty, speed feels like leadership. But speed without constraint slowly reshapes the system. What begins as an exception becomes a norm. What begins as the dismiss becomes dominance. Health policy is especially vulnerable to this dynamic. Crises create fear. Fear creates urgency. Urgency justifies bypassing deliberation. And once leaders discover that they can act unilaterally well to immediate political cost, the temptation to do so grows. The withdrawal from who allows this script. It avoids prolonged debate. It avoids shared responsibility. It avoids the friction that comes with multilateral cooperation. Instead, it consolidates control within a narrow decision-making circle while presenting the move as a defense of national autonomy. But autonomy at the top often means vulnerability at the bottom. Where power is centralized, accountability becomes diffused. If a future health crisis spirals out of control, blame will scatter. International organizations will be blamed for irrelevance. State governments will be blamed for incompetence. Citizens will be blamed for non-compliance. And the original decision makers will claim that circumstances were unforeseeable. This is how modern governance failure works. No single actor is fully responsible, yet everyone pays the price. Isolation also changes how information flows. Inside global institutions, data moves laterally. Warnings circulate. Patterns are detected collectively. Outside those systems, information becomes filtered through national lenses. Signals are delayed. Interpretation becomes politicized. Bad news travels slower than good news because bad news carries political cost. This creates an illusion of control. Leaders appear calm. Messaging remains confident. But beneath the surface, uncertainty grows. When reality finally breaks through, it does so violently. For ordinary Americans, this matters because information delays translate directly into risk of personal risk. It means slower guidance, conflicting recommendations, reactive measures instead of preventive ones, and confusion at the worst possible time. At the same time, domestic narratives become more tightly managed. When cooperation with external institutions decreases, internal messaging becomes more centralized. Complexity is simplified. Uncertainty is downplayed. Confidence is projected. This is not necessarily malicious. It is structural. Governments under pressure prefer coherence over nuance. But nuance is exactly what citizens need to make informed decisions during crisis. As a result, people begin to feel manipulated rather than informed. They sense that messaging is designed to maintain control rather than convey truth. Trust erodes further. As trust is lost, it is almost impossible to rebuild during an emergency. Compliance becomes selective. Guidance becomes optional. And collective action breaks down. The economic dimension of this power shift is equally important. Health crises justify extraordinary fiscal measures. Emergency spending expands. Debt accumulates. Monetary policy becomes more aggressive. Inflationary pressures rise. Past measures are often necessary in the short term. But when crises are measurable or prolonged, the economic costs compound. Inflation becomes embedded. Asset price disconnect from wages. Inequality widens. Owns agent, the burden falls disproportionately on those with the least fortune. Wealthier Americans hedge against inflation. They own assets. They have flexibility. Lower income and middle class Americans do not. Their wealth is tied away rent and basic consumption. A prolonged or poorly coordinated crisis adds a silent tax on these grabs. It erodes purchasing power. It increases debt dependence. It deepens precarity. This is where abuse of power becomes visible not as repression but as neglect. The system continues to function but only for those who can afford its failures. The irony is that policies framed as protecting sovereignty often risk real autonomy for citizens. True autonomy means security, predictability, and access to reliable information. It means the ability to plan a future without constant fear of systemic shock. When governments prioritize control over cooperation, citizens lose that autonomy. Their lives become more reactive, more fragile, more exposed to decisions they cannot influence. There is also a geopolitical dimension that really reaches public debate. By withdrawing from global health leadership, the United States created space for others to fill. Influence does not disappear when one actor leaves. It shifts. Countries that remain engaged shape standards, narratives, and networks. They build trust. They accumulate soft power. Over time, this affects everything from pharmaceutical supply chains to scientific collaboration. American citizens may not feel this immediately, but long-term influence erosion translates into weaker negotiating positions, reduced access, and diminished global leverage. That weakness eventually feeds back into domestic outcomes. What makes this trajectory especially dangerous is its self-reinforcing nature. Isolation breeds vulnerability. Vulnerability breeds fear. Fear justifies further concentration of power. And the cycle repeats. At each stage, citizens are told that these measures are temporary, necessary, and protective. Yet each step normalizes a system where decisions are made faster, narrower, and farther from public oversight. The result is not dictatorship. It is something more subtle and more corrosive. A democracy where participation feels symbolic, where institutions exist but struggle to constrain, and where citizens sense that outcomes are predetermined. This is why the withdrawal from who resonates so deeply. It is not about one organization. It is about the direction of governance. About whether the United States moves toward cooperation and resilience to coalition and control. For many Americans, the fear is not that the country will collapse overnight. It is that it will slowly harden into a system that manages crisis poorly, distributes pain unfairly, and asks citizens to absorb risks they did not choose. And the most unsettling question remains Yunan's word. When the next crisis arrives, will the system prioritize protecting people or protecting power? What ultimately breaks societies, not catastrophe itself, but exhaustion. Not fear, but prolonged uncertainty. And not oppression, but the quiet realization that the system no longer responds to ordinary people. This is the psychological cost that HEP policies like this impose, and it is the cost list discussed, list measured. For millions of Americans, daily life already feels like survival rather than progress. Bills arrive faster than paychecks. Rent rises while ownership slips further away. Healthcare remains one accident away from financial disaster. Parents worry not about ambition, but stability. Young people delay families, homes, and futures. Older generations feel their savings eroded by force they cannot control. In this environment, governance decisions that increase uncertainty hit harder than any speech can soften. When people sense that leaders are willing to gamble with systemic risk for political positioning, something fundamental shifts. Hope gives way to vigilance. Trust gives way to suspicion. Participation gives way to withdrawal. This is how societies hollow out from within. The withdrawal from global health coordination becomes, in this context, not a policy debate, but a physiological signal. It tells citizens that even in matters of life and death, decisions can be made abruptly, unilaterally for reasons. It reinforces the feeling the safety is conditional, temporary, and negotiable. For the average American, this manifests quietly. Fewer long-term plans. More contingency thinking. A constant background anxiety that the next shock is coming and that when it does, institutions will scramble rather than proact. People adapt, but adaptation is not resilience. It is endurance. And endurance has limits. When endurance wears thin, social cohesion fractures. Communities become less forgiving. Political discourse becomes harsher. Every crisis interpreted through a lens of blame rather than solidarity. People stop asking how to solve problems together and start asking who to shield themselves from. This is the real danger of power exercised without restraint. It does not need to suppress division. It simply creates conditions where dissent becomes inevitable and cooperation becomes biased impossible. As trust erodes, people disengage from collective civility. They stop believing that the sacrifice will be shared fairly. They stop believing that compliance leads to protection. They stop believing that institutions act in good faith. In a future health crisis, this loss of belief is far more damaging than any logistical failure. Hospitals can be expanded. Supply chains can be rebuilt. But just cannot be improvised in an emergency. When guidance is ignored, response fragments. When response fragments, outcomes worsen. When outcomes worsen, fear accelerates. And fear justifies even greater concentration of power. This is the feedback loop that transforms democracy slowly, without a single traumatic rupture. There is also a generational cost. Young Americans are growing up in a world defined by overlapping crises. Financial instability, health uncertainty, political polarization, climate risk. For them, withdrawal from global corporations does not feel like independence. It feels like abandonment. They do not see strength in isolation. They see vulnerability disguised as confidence. And that perception shapes how they engage with the country, their institutions, and their future. Some will disengage entirely. Others will radicalize. Many will simply retreat to private survival strategies, focusing on personal resilience rather than public good. A society built on individual coping rather than collective trust is brittle. It functions until it doesn't. And when it breaks unfairly. The cruel irony is that many of the people most supportive of unilateral power believe it will protect them. They believe discipline equals safety. But power concentrated at the top rarely shields those at the bottom. It insulates decision makers while exposing everyone else. True protection comes from systems that distribute risk, share information, and absorb shocks collectively. From institutions that slow decisions when slowing down prevents catastrophe. From leadership that values resilience over spectacle. When those qualities are replaced by speed, control, and confrontation, the result is not strength. It is fragility. History rarely announces turning points in advance. They are recognized later, in hindsight, when patterns become clear. When people realize that a series of small decisions reshaped the trajectory of a nation. Withdrawal from global health cooperation may one day be remembered not as a bold stand but as part of a broader retreat from shared responsibility. Not as a defense of sovereignty, but as a surrender of right. For ordinary Americans, the question is not ideological. It is practical. When the next crisis arises, will the system move fast enough to protect lives? Will information be transparent? Will guidance be trusted? Will sacrifice be shared fairly? Or will people once again be told to endure uncertainty, absorb losses, and adapt on their own? The most unsettling truth is that by the time the time-fast questions are answered, it will already be too late to change the decisions that shape them. Power exercised without restraint always assumes it will have time to correct course. History suggests otherwise. And when the consequences finally surface, they do not arrive as headlines or speeches. They arrive quietly in hospital waiting rooms, grocery aisles, workplace and homes. They arrive as stress, fatigue, debt and grief. By then, the debate about institutions will feel distant. What will remain is a simple, brutal resignation to system show speed over safety, control over cooperation, and power over people. And the people were left to carry the weight.